Hello, my name is Fraser Simons. This is my channel Springboard Thought. Today I'm doing the favorite books that I read this year but aren't published this year. And this worked out to a top 20 list. I'm going to be fairly quick about them because it's 20 books, but I'll try to explain why I love them so much. The first book is Topics of Conversation, which kind of dropped with a thud, it seems like, a year or two ago. And I had only just gotten to it because so many people kind of warned me off of it. However, I thought that this book was exceptionally written, very, I guess, bold or daring in its presentation of the critical nature of the actual protagonist. And it really got into granular details about life that subjectively you could create a portrait around for each of these people. And it was very strange, the critical reaction to this book I felt. People on Goodreads were like, okay, but she's not very likable. And it's kind of like your best friend sharing the most deepest, darkest, most intimate things about them, both good and bad, and then being like, she's not very likable. That's not the point. Next, I wanted to talk about Loveless by Alice Oseman. She doesn't need an introduction, probably. If you're reading YA, she's exceptionally popular with the Heartbreaker series, Radio Silence, literally anything that she puts out. Loveless is about a girl who is questioning whether she is ace, but the identity shifts are much more subtle. It goes into granular detail into her thinking about her sexuality and where it aligns with asexuality, if at all. And each of her friend groups all sort of tick the boxes, yes, of diversity, representation, but also act as like a foil in which she can sort of attempt to look at herself and draw some sort of self-portrait whatsoever. It really delivers, as you might expect, a heartfelt, excellent narrative about a questioning teen/woman coming into her own, and about asexuality in general, bisexuality, a great number of intersections of people going into college, and I just found it fascinating. Next is Butter Honey Pig Bread. This is a Canada Reads selection for this year, I believe. So it came out last year. Excellent book. It's hard to explain, but essentially this is about twins who experience the same event in different ways in childhood, which is traumatic and drives a schism into their relationship that isn't even attempted to be repaired until later. The trajectory of their past runs parallel to what's happening in the present day, where they're ostensibly going to get together, and food plays a central role in their lives. It's excellent food literature if you've ever read any of that, but it's also just an excellent character study and the secret in which every family member has to sort of examine the memory that they form around the traumatic event, which is only later examined, is just completely compelling. It's an incredible book. Next one is The Break by Katherena Vermette, the first book I've read by her, I want to say, which, I mean, I've read a lot of them now by the end of this year. But The Break is just so good. The prose leap out of the page. It's biting. It examines racism in Canada in a very different way than you're expecting. It's a mystery, a murder mystery, potentially. It's about Indigenous women. It's got so much going for it. I kind of think that the less you know about it, the better. But I can almost promise you that if you just give it 3 or 4 pages, it's going to hook you immediately. Next is Girl Made of Stars. This book is YA, and geez, is it ever tackling hard subject matter in an excellent manner, in my opinion. This is about twins who go to the same school. Everything sort of points to them being on a really good trajectory, their life being good, when the inciting incident happens, which is her twin brother goes to a party, which she is at as well. And so everybody has different accounts of this. And his girlfriend accuses him of raping her. It is fairly intersectional in the way that it examines this. It makes it more of a complex situation than a typical rape allegation, and the manner in which it interacts with her and her identity and confronts certain aspects of herself as well as the things that she thought she knew about her twin, what's valid, what is not, what is put into question, what is not, was just exceptional. It is heavy subject matter. Like I said, I think it tackles it very well, but there's content warnings that stem from this that are logical. Next is I'm Afraid of Men. This is a trans woman's very short memoir that is examining the specific subject of why she is afraid of men. It goes much deeper than this. It is an excellent audiobook narrated by the author. It essentially examines the role of masculine in society as well as the gender performance of it. As it relates to her, as her identity and her trajectory onto where she is now, as well as her partner, his failings, his accomplishments, the way that the community and herself looks at him based on the performance that he does in the community. And I thought it was just fascinating. I learned a lot, and I liked that she actually proposed very specific reframes and useful thinking for the things rather than, I don't know, what people normally think of, just like a teardown of these things. It's very nuanced, complex. Next is When All Is Said. This was such a good book. Also, the audiobook is quite good, narrated by an Irishman. And I guess those narrators that are Irish just kind of get me. But the physical is also quite good. It's about an older man who is basically more or less telling his life story by going to a bar and having a drink, toasting specific individuals in his life. It is so well told. The voice in this is masterclass. His life observations, his nuances of people's, especially as they perceive him as an older man, and his sort of burgeoning examination of his surroundings and his environment as it changed over his long-lived life, and the specific notion that he's contemplating as he's consuming these beverages is just, it's completely excellent, gripping. I'm pretty sure I consumed it in a day. Next is Feast Your Eyes. This is an excellent examination of women being allowed to be themselves. Again, it's like a young woman who very much cherishes her ability to be free and do whatever she wants, sort of gets her identity subsumed when she gets pregnant by a man who is extremely doting, not intentionally controlling, but so sort of loving that he unintentionally cages her. She becomes like a photographer and kind of lives out her life in her art and examines her femininity, her feminist principles, her own inner nature through this. But then the story is also only narrated, I think, mostly from the daughter's perspective, which gives a very interesting bent to it all. So the character of the mother is very nuanced. We see the sort of trauma or the processing of childhood in the daughter, and the perspective from both people creates just like the most intricate, nuanced picture, like a portrait masterfully done, and then the daughter coming and like adding detail to it or something. It's just a fantastic read. I'm surprised more people didn't talk about this when it came out, and it didn't really make much prize list, but I just thought it was phenomenal. I've been talking about this a lot lately, Noopiming. This book is just incredible. It's non-Western centric, more so than anything I have ever consumed. It's about a young Indigenous woman who's on the ice dying, and then her consciousness reaches out to all the different aspects of Indigenous people and culture throughout the, I guess, Canada at large, but I believe mostly around Toronto and her culture, if I remember correctly. And what it does is that it really challenges your notion of what a story is and can be, what even a person is and can be. There's different classifications or etymology for certain words that are placed in this book, especially as chapter headers and whatnot. And all of the characters themselves represent very larger aspects of indigeneity, culture, mythology, interactions with the world. It's very hard to explain in a succinct manner, but it is incredible. I know people have confronted the value proposition of a book that has a lot less words on the page sometimes, but for me, it made me really digest what was on the page and create a very specific cadence to the prose, where even pages with just one or two sentences have a lot of weight. It makes you re-examine the sentences, and when you move on to the next, again, it creates this odd pacing mechanism that simply isn't used in other books because of the way that we view white space and value propositions around what should be filling a page, etc. It is phenomenal. I highly recommend it. If you're going to choose one book out of any of these and you want the most different, the most interesting, the top book of the year for me, I would pick up Noopiming. Next is The Years by Annie Ernaux. I tabbed this quite a bit. This is an odd little book where she is looking at her life from 1941 to 2006, and she makes herself basically a part of the general intellect, the gestalt of the entire community that she is in. And so by proxy, she is sort of acknowledging the problematic aspects of the culture on a tide. She makes herself complicit in the wrong thinking at a cultural level, while also sometimes differentiating between the two when it is distinct. Otherwise, her impression of the year or the time, the month, whatever, is the cultural moment. And so I thought that was really interesting. The prose are just fire all of the time. Even the structures of the paragraphs, especially early on, kind of mimic her young self versus her older self. Things become more fuller. The paragraphs become quite different. It's a distinct beast all around. And it is just extremely captivating, I thought. I only am born 3/4 of the way through this book, so it was completely fascinating. But it also really adequately, exceptionally really, shows the cyclical nature of culture, especially as it pertains to history, politics, conservative movements especially, which is something I'm very aware of being in a province that has mostly been governed by conservatives. Excellent book. One of the most pleasant surprises of the year for me was Three Dreams in the Key of G. Marc is an excellent booktuber who examines books very eruditely. He is very interested in the form of the novel, and so I wondered what a book like his would be, and this is almost quintessentially, I think, Marc Nash, in that it is complex. The diction is very complex. I've read some things that are a little bit more complex where you pretty much have to have a dictionary right next to you. This plays with language. It's very feminist. It examines three different characters from three different perspectives, all under siege at the same time. And we get to see how they react to this. And the reactions are fascinating. The characters are vivid. It is extremely well done. It is very complex. It's eminently rereadable, I think. So you can see I tabbed it somewhat as well. I definitely will reread this at time, and I think I will get more out of it. But it is essentially about, as I see it, the hubris of man. It examines science, the theory around science, how we approach science, as well as these characters, all in a very clever manner that ties in perfectly well. You wouldn't think it would when you're maybe at first consuming it, but it really brings everything together. One of the best reads of the year by far, for sure. Speaking of sort of complex circuitous roots, Ficciones by Borges was an incredible read. Borges likes to validate or use as buttressing fictional things that appear true. He creates labyrinths in the form of the book, likes to play around with the reader and use similar sort of diction and verbiage in a playful manner as Marc Nash does to get across multiple meanings in the mastery of words, and really makes you think about what is being consumed in a very compelling way. It is an invitation more so than a demand to understand each specific story, and they all build on each other. They all, again, kind of create this maze, and it is confusing at first, but the bewilderment is extremely pleasant. Next is Freshwater. I love this book so much. It is intersectional with mental health as well as demons, of which I cannot remember the name, but they are originating in Africa, I believe. And it's about a young girl who is possessed by this spirit, this demon, and her life is sort of derided by these moments in which it is able to assert agency over her and take over her. And there is some kind of infighting, but there's, whether you want to view it as a mental health issue or a spiritual issue or both, the text supports it, I think. It is absolutely incredible prose. The characters are very vivid, the situation's relatable somehow, and it was just a very surprising, very short read. And when I read Dear Cyntharin, I think that's what it's called, her collection that came out this year, which is like a memoir with very specific letters to different people explaining certain things. It is a very good tie into Freshwater to understanding more about what is going on there. So if you want to read more Imezi, I would definitely recommend that next for you. Next is a science fiction book, The Employees. Oh boy, is this good. It's a little bit odd. It is not genre convention specific whatsoever. It's very much literary fiction instead. It's about a futuristic vessel that takes on these odd objects from a specific planet that they take, and it starts altering the crew in different ways. The interplay between the space and the objects and the change in the environment from which the company and the employees do not understand, in the way that it alters them fundamentally in some ways, and the situation that erupts because of it is fascinating. But then the presentation is even more so. All the events are from a human resource sort of standpoint in which they're being interviewed by a telepresence, essentially, and then compiled into documents. It is somewhat linearly presented, but there are portions of it that are outright missing because it's numbered as well. So it's kind of like a mystery as well, but it is very critical and brings more so into human nature, human condition, and the things that a lot of SFF takes for granted when crafting science fiction type stories in space, and sort of takes the piss on it, I guess, in some ways, but in a very clever and not like condescending way, I would say. Next is The Invention of Moral. This is sort of Borges-esque in that it's kind of confusing. It's about a person who is marooned on an island who then begins to see images of this woman who becomes completely enamored with. He then starts stalking her and trying to figure out what's going on. And the genre shifts in this book quite often. The purpose of it, even the way that we look at the main character shifts quite often, from a kind of harmless person to maybe like a stalker, right? To more escalations from there. He is in an island which is a maze of himself. Internally, he's in a maze trying to make his way out. And then the reader has its own sort of conundrum trying to understand what is happening at a meta level within both of those situations. It's excellent. Duck's Newborn Report probably needs no introduction. I thought this was absolutely fantastic. And yes, I think it needed to be this length. It sort of gets its hooks into you, and you begin to freely associate her stream of consciousness in this book in a manner that is just unlike anything I've ever experienced. It is sometimes unsettling, but fantastic. It's simply about a housewife, but there is much more to it than that. I don't really want to give it away, but it's about acts of consumerism, consuming us. It's about trauma. It's about the way that America has completely messed itself up under capitalism, what that has done to individuals, even generations older than the millennials that get blamed for everything. It's about so many things. It is quintessentially American, but also capitalist, also Western society. It tackles so much, well, I guess as it should, but the stream of consciousness in it is, Miss Dalloway-esque. But I have a review of this out where it was keener in my mind and I could probably explain it better, so just check that out. Another video I have is the Vina Nostra one, which is one of the first I ever put on YouTube 6 months ago or so. I came on BookTube looking for an explainer for this book to see if I was right about it or not. I didn't find one, so I ended up rereading it and then, going conspiracy board on it. This is probably my favorite, or close to it, in the top 3 science fiction / fantasy book, and it is / it could be both. It's a magical school story, kind of, in which a young girl is essentially coerced into going to a magic school, and there is a subject that is taught that nobody understands, which is ostensibly the magic. And they find that as they are taking the course and consuming the materials, it is sort of like colonizing their mind, altering them, and from there things spiral out, I suppose. This is very abbreviated. I'd definitely check out the video instead, but it's Kafka-esque. It's dark fantasy for sure. There's some pretty dark themes in there. Sexual assault is taking place at one point. It is very critical, again, of capitalism, Kafka-esque, so it's very critical of bureaucratic systems. The magic system is the most interesting magic system ever, period, and I've read a lot. It presents itself as a mystery that the reader needs to think of as it is being consumed in tandem with the main protagonist, and such. I don't think there's been a book where I figured out what the mystery was that was as satisfying as this. Next is Affect by Charlene Elsby. This is kind of tied with Psychros for me, but I think this one is slightly more interesting to me. Maybe because it's the first one I consumed of hers, I don't know. But it's about a philosophy student that meets a guy, they hook up, and things start spiraling from there. She has a very vivid imagination, so it becomes very surrealistic, as you might expect from the cover. I think you're kind of set up for it, essentially. And her mode of thinking is very different. It's very from a philosophical, high concept level. And so every interaction has that bent to it. It's still easy to consume, I think, and it makes it very different and tilted. It is ostensibly a love story, but it also sort of tackles the way in which her cemented philosophy needs to adhere or give way to another person's philosophy, and what that does to her at the concept level with their own physical bodies, meeting as well. So yeah, it was just completely fantastic. One of my favorite discoveries of the year. The next is sort of perfunctory, but if you've never read Rumi, this will blow your little mind, I think. This is the best Rumi that I can find because it has 4 or 5 different translators doing separate pieces. Some of them are even the same, so you can see how the translations differ from each one. The Coleman Barks one is trash, don't touch it. It's not even Rumi. This is actually his poetry, actually interpreted by translators, versus Coleman Barks having read other people's translations, internalized it in his own way, and then regurgitated it, versus, a Western perspective that is very puritanical. This is the real stuff. I would also like some people to recommend me other Rumi stuff that is actually well translated. And yeah, it's spirituality, Eastern philosophy. It tackles a lot of different subjects, but the thing I could liken to it the most maybe is the prophet. Although less advice to people, this is his cemented thinking, and then also just incredible poetry. I don't read a lot of poetry, so take it with a grain of salt, but I imagine most people think highly of Rumi. And finally, In the Woods by Tana French, a recent read of mine. This was exceptional. Scandinavian noir, except in Ireland. This is about a pair of detectives, Rob and Cassie. Primarily from Rob's perspective, they're on the Dublin murder squad. They catch a case in his former place that he was living when he was a child, and it unearths, I guess we could say, traumatic events that he had pushed to the background of his person. He and 2 kids disappeared in the woods, and only he emerged. Then when he catches a case, obviously all this is dredged up. He's trying to work both cases at the same time, but the A plot, more or less for me, it's not actually, it's a B plot, but for me, the best parts of it was the interplay between Cassie and Rob. They have such an interesting dynamic and relationship. It was not at all derivative or a trope of the genre, and it progressed in a very interesting way. The actual murder story, I guess, I thought was very fascinating, though the killers presents themselves quite early, I guess, as a lot of these do, but I think you would guess who it is fairly early on, so it becomes kind of a whodunit, which was similarly fantastic. I really like those kinds of books, The Secret History, stuff like that. But the prose are vivid, it's very critical and subversive, and in a very clever way, kind of like post-crime novel, in that it's very critical of the tropes presented in the book, especially Rob himself, toxic masculinity, the trauma cycle, the cyclical nature of trauma victims and perpetrating crimes. A lot of stuff. It's fantastic. I'm considering making a separate video for this, so if I do, look out for it. And that's it. That's the top 20 books that I gave 5 stars that were not published in 2021, at least according to Goodreads, if it's to be believed. But the easiest sorting mechanism for me at 585 books or whatever it is. And I will still put out another video, which was the biggest disappointments for me as well, and why. So I think between this video, the previous video, and the one upcoming, you'll see my tastes quite vividly, I guess. Other than that, I hope that you are well. I hope you're having a good 2022, and be safe.